Are you a businesswoman who is finding it challenging to get your ideas across and make a point? Welcome to Speakers Who Get Results with Elizabeth Bachman, a podcast dedicated to helping women get the visibility they want, whether making a speech or talking in a meeting. Every week, get valuable lessons from Elizabeth or learn from her roundtable conversations with experts and speakers on how to make a difference, not just a point. On to the show with your host, Elizabeth Bachman.
Hello, and welcome to Speakers Who Get Results. I'm Elizabeth Bachman, your host, and this is the podcast where we talk about leadership, communication, presentation skills, and what you need to really make your way in this world. Before I get started on our conversation today in the interview, I'd like to invite you to see where your presentation skills stack up by taking our free 4-minute assessment at speakforresultsquiz.com. That's www.speakforresultsquiz.com. And that's where you can see where your presentation skills are strong and where perhaps a little bit of support could help you get the results you need and the recognition that you deserve. My guest today is Russel Lolacher, who is an international keynote speaker and an advocate for meaningful work relationships. He's the creator and host of the podcast Relationships at Work, the Leadership Guide to Creating a Workplace We Love. It's a podcast and a YouTube show where he talks with global experts on how to improve their leadership, their employee experiences, and workplace cultures. He's held successful leadership and communication roles for almost 30 years, retaining one team for almost 12 years. His work and expertise in building employee and customer trust has been recognized in international stages in global publications like Forbes and as a 4 times named thought leader by the International Customer Management Institute. And he's also lots of fun. He has a wonderful laugh. I really had a delightful conversation with him. Here's the interview with Russel Lolacher. Russel Lolacher, welcome to Speakers Who Get Results.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, good. Well, we're having fun. We've been laughing a lot before. I thought I better start the recording, or we're going to run out of time here. Before we start the interview, the questions I have for you, I'd like to know who would be your dream interview. If you could share the stage with anyone who's no longer with us, who would it be? What would you ask them? And who should be listening?
Oh, that is such a great question and such a hard one. I'm going to be super Canadian here, Elizabeth.
Okay.
And I'm going to pick John Candy.
John Candy, the actor. Okay. Yeah.
John Candy, the actor. So I grew up with John Candy being a part of SCTV, which was the Canadian version of Saturday Night Live. And there was just this presence of this man who was well known in his industry as being accessible, kind. We lost him way too soon, but I loved his ability to be creative and to be relatable. No matter what he did, you can argue whether he was a great actor or not, but he certainly knew who he was. He knew his brand. He knew how to connect with people, and he did it at such a large scale while also being extremely personal. So I can see there being so much to learn from that individual, from John Candy. That's probably going to blow people away going, John Candy, really? Yeah, John Candy.
John Candy, yes, the actor. I remember him well. So what would you ask him? Say you were interviewing him for your podcast. What would you ask him?
Absolutely. And as my podcast is all about relationships, I think I would ask him about relatability. I think that's the biggest question I would ask, is that he plays the lovable schlubs, for lack of a better term, planes, trains, and automobiles and so forth. How do you play this character that is not, he didn't never ventured far off from being close to kind of who he was as an actor. Michael J. Fox is very similar to that in his acting. Needless to say, I would ask him about his relatability. How can you be relatable no matter what environment or story you're telling? How can you continue to be a relatable person that people feel like they can connect to?
Okay.
Love that.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. And, he played the lovable, funny guy who was never the romantic lead. He was always the funny sidekick, but he would lead off he would be the lead actor in a movie. So that's pretty good.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that is a skill. That is not something that people just show up and do. That is a leadership skill set that
Right.
I think is sorely missing in that relatability, because we get so lost and move on to whatever we're working on that there's that connection that sometimes can get lost over time.
Yeah, well, and it's a great character actor to then lead the movie and be the lead person. That's really tells you something. So talking about relatability, your work is all about relationships at work. You don't mean love relationships. You mean how, and I bet you get that question a lot, right?
I did when I first started, for sure I did. And I would have a lot of guests. I get these pitches about how to find love at work. I'm like, you don't listen to my podcast, do you? It has nothing to do with making out or building that kind of relationship.
Yes, well, and they're the people who are that. So how you get along with your colleagues or not is such an important part of our lives. I mean, most of us in our working lives are working, it's a huge amount of time. So for leaders, since this podcast is really about leadership, among the many things, leadership and stepping forward and claiming your leadership, where are leaders missing opportunities to make the workplace relationships in their workplaces better?
Oh, absolutely. I think I've said this repeatedly, and I think the first step before we get into any sort of tactics or direction, I think any leader really needs two things. And I always call them your superpowers. If you can get good at this, and you'll never be perfect, that's why it's an ongoing process, is self-awareness and situational awareness. You can't move forward in how you impact the organization until you understand what your impact is now, until you understand your relationships now, until you understand how you show up. Like I was saying at the beginning about relatability, are you relatable? Do people feel like you can connect with you? You can't build relationships if you're the narcissist, as everybody assumes you might be, being in a lofty, a position of power. People think, they think it's just about them. Oh, they're doing another presentation, it's about them. That might be the furthest thing from the truth. But if that's the case, I remember watching a panel exercise of executives once, and it was the CEO and his suite of executives answering questions from the organization. Anytime anybody but the CEO answered a question, the CEO came in and either clarified or felt they needed to add information at the end of the response. Ooh. So literally live in a organization-wide video chat, he was micromanaging his executive team.
Oh, now, ouch.
Oh, it was not a good look. And the funny thing is that happened, say 2007. I'm just picking a random year. Years later, I was doing a presentation setup in the organization, and this was some other unrelatable thing, completely nothing to do with it. And I was working with one of the staff that was helping me set up the presentation. And she brought that up.
Oh, really?
3 years later, she brought that up going, oh, yeah, remember when blah, blah, blah did that in front of everybody? So not only was it something that happened, it wasn't an isolated innocent in a moment of time. That reputation carried with that person. They weren't even in the organization anymore.
3 years later. Okay.
Years later, but they still remembered that as a sort of a litmus test of what leadership should look like in front of the organization. So the self-awareness of that individual, non-existent.
Well, you just said a test of what leadership should look like. You mean what leadership should not look like, or was he the example of what it should or should not look like?
Oh, sure as heck not look like. I mean, he had no concept of that's what he was doing, that he was undermining a leadership team that was supposed to be driving his vision and mission. Meanwhile, he's sitting there going, you're not getting it right. You're not getting it right. You're not getting it right in front of everybody. So his situational awareness in that moment, and his self-awareness of his brand were both horrendous. So I think if anything to start down the path of improving your leadership is really self-assessment. It's really understanding who you are, how you show up, how you react, how you communicate, who are you as an individual. And then as a leader, I think it's really working your way into understanding the organization. And that comes into, there's so many surveys out right now that certainly ramped up over COVID, where they would interview executives and employees. And the gap between what the executive thinks is going on versus what the employees know is going on has been getting wider and wider and wider. And I think as an organization, you really need to take that seriously. And that comes from pulse surveys, check-ins, just really understanding your organization, because then you can understand what to lean into and what you might need to address. So yeah, I think it's really knowing you and knowing them before you can lead anything.
What do you say to the people who said, I'm the leader, they should just do what I tell them? In some countries that I work with, some organizations I work with, that is the attitude from senior management.
Absolutely.
I pay you, you just do what you're told.
Sure. And if you have robots and widgets, that makes a lot of sense. But if you work with humans, that makes no sense, because humans need personalization. They need to feel like their work is valued. That manager that will say, for money and because of my role, I'm guessing their employee retention probably isn't that great, because people want relationships. People want to feel like they go to work and it matters, as opposed to feeling like a cog in a wheel that serves somebody rather than serving a purpose. And really, that is a disconnect. That is not a leader. By sheer definition, that is not a leader. That is a manager and an order giver, not a leader. And
someone's not showing leadership. It's very interesting, because I work a lot with in Europe, and I work with German companies where, yes, people really care, but the hierarchy is really important. Whereas you and I are from North America and the West Coast too, which is even a little bit less formal. Nowadays, post-COVID, people will leave if they're unhappy. And I think a lot of organizations have not adjusted to that or recognized that.
There was an empowerment that really happened over COVID. I had a conversation about this last night with a colleague about how generationally it seems to be changing too. So I'm a Gen Xer, and so I was raised by boomers. I understood baby boomers are, you start a job, you work there 30 years, you work yourself up the ladder, you retire, celebration, here's your watch. As a Gen X person, we knew that wasn't it, but we didn't have any other model to rely on. It was still like, oh, that's how it's supposed to be because my parents, it's not the experience I'm having, but I keep being told that's what my parents. And then millennials come along and they're like, I don't want to go to meetings that don't matter. This could have been an email. And us as Gen Xers are like, you can do that? Like, I know that all along. I knew this meeting was stupid, but I didn't know you could actually say that out loud. So millennials are really showing that there can be boundaries. There can be an understanding. And this is international. I interview people much like yourself all around the world. And even though cultures are very different, the feeling a need to be valued, the need to feel like your work matters is universal. They just might not be speaking up as much because the culture is different, but it is there.
Yeah, well, and it's also important to understand the culture. It's a very international business world now. And quite often we're working remotely with people who are in several time zones. And I think about time zones a lot. And sometimes I talk to my friends who work locally and they said, well, how do you calculate the difference between Pacific and Central and Eastern time? And you mean there's another one? I said, well, yeah, Nova Scotia has another time zone. And in an international world, how can we, basically working remotely, how can we still improve relationships when you can't actually walk into somebody's office and say, hi, happy birthday, something like that.
I believe that the rise of remote work really also demonstrated the lack of leadership development we have across the board. There are so many people in leadership positions, great people, that have no leadership experience whatsoever, or training for that matter. And the reason I bring that up is you are not a good leader or a bad leader by defining the geography of your staff. Mm-hmm. Just because your staff is in a different location doesn't mean how you build a relationship, intention, effort changes. Just by putting digital in front of something doesn't make it a different thing. There's no such thing as digital leadership. It's just leadership. Mm-hmm. So by having remote work, then having screens on matters, because I get to see my hand communication. You get to see the inflection more of my voice, my facial expressions. That is extremely important when building those connections. I've worked with teams remotely and in person. I have great relationships with both, because the only difference between remote is you have to be more intentional and you have to be put in more effort, because you can't walk past that cubicle, because you can't just stand in a hallway and have a conversation. Having said that, you can have a quick message on Instant Messenger and go, hey, do you have 5 minutes? And then pop on a quick call. It can be that spontaneity as well. It doesn't need to be so structured just because it's remote. It can be human. It can be very more relatable as a conversation by not being so stringent and going, unless I'm having a meeting, I'm not talking to people. That is a missed opportunity by any stretch. Is be spontaneous. Be that person that just shows up and go, hey, how was your weekend? Yeah. You can do that over a video call. You don't need to just do that in person.
Well, and it's very interesting the way you're talking about this. I've been thinking, I talk to people about this a lot. So as a podcast host and in my work, let's talk a little bit about the balance between being friends and leading, having those boundaries. Because one thing, I have certainly worked with many women who have lost their power because they wanted to be friends with everybody. And then when they needed to say, just do it because I said so, people didn't. How can you talk a little bit about what you've seen? Where's that balance?
Absolutely. I think you've highlighted right there where the challenge is. And that's when leaders lead with, hey, let's be friends before let me be your leader. There's no established respect. There's no established competency. There's no established consistency as leader if you lead with, we're just buddies, right? Very much, you can't grow leadership from friendship. You can grow friendship from leadership. You need to set the baseline in that we are here to do a job. I'm here to back you up. I'm here to be a good leader and defend and work with you to do the job. But that can't be friendship to start, because if you start with friendship, people have an expectations of what a friend would do. Well, what a friend would do is let you get away with stuff you may not get away with normally. It's, you know what, it's, oh, well, that's okay. Or, hey, let's hang out after work. You are setting a standard where it's not about delivery, productivity, growth. You are setting a stage of equalities across the board. That has nothing to do with it. It's how the relationship is set. But if there's a leader, and I've had a lot of success with this, is if you start with as a leader and show, this is how I discipline, this is how I don't let you get away with anything, but we still have mutual respect. This is how I handle things when it's a difficult conversation. Then people have a baseline and a foundation in which to understand you, where the friendship can grow from there. So also,
and giving clear direction, being very clear who's responsible for what exactly you want them to do. As you're talking about this, I think about some of the mistakes I made earlier in my career. And Joe, I'm sorry, that was not very good. I think about a few of the times where I wanted to be friends first. I wasn't giving clear direction, and it was a disaster. Hopefully you learn that one in a not too stressful situation. I think about some of the ways I screwed up. So
And you can have amazing friendships. I don't want to take that away. Relationships can be amazing. You can have the deepest, most robust relationships from the workplace, from a a colleague standpoint, but you need to set a baseline, or the employee or the team will put expectations on you that isn't appropriate as a leader. So no, it's you can have both. You just have to start with leadership.
It's actually, hierarchies are there for a reason. It is a functional, it's a way that an organization can function if you know who's responsible for what and when. As we're talking about this, however, let me say, people are so busy now. And most of us, if we open up our emails in the morning, there are 5 different fires to put out. Taking the time to engage with your team and find out how that takes time. So how does a busy leader find the time to create that engagement that's also going to keep them on the team instead of having them to one day they just don't show up?
Love this question. I really think you can't actually be a leader if all you do is go from one meeting to the next, to the next, to the next. That's not leadership. That is, you're a commodity to the organization. You are just a bauble that's being moved around. That's not leadership by any stretch of the imagination, regardless of your title, regardless of your self-perception. Where the leadership comes into this is intention. And intention can be, and I found this extremely helpful, is scheduling time with your team for one-on-ones. I found it extremely successful to set up a time with them. It's their time. For a half an hour, it can be once a week, once a month, every other month. It really depends on your relationship and the needs of your employee, your team member, but you have to know them well enough to know what meets their needs. It's really about putting them first and going, okay, a half hour a day, it's your time. We can talk about anything. We can talk about your growth. We can talk about career. We can talk about challenges. We can talk about nothing about work. We can talk about you as a human and some of the challenges you might have at home, maybe what your learning opportunities are. It can be 5 minutes. It can be 30 minutes. It's your time to define what that conversation is. I'm not saying you don't organically talk to them every day, check-ins, get to know them, but having that additional effort of providing them a sandbox in which for you to have that conversation and connection, it is astronomically useful. I remember doing this with my teams, and I would even try to cancel it because I'm like, are they still useful? And they would be so pissed. They'd be so bothered, the idea of even canceling these things, because they found such value in it, where they got to pull themselves away from the day-to-day and be themselves in a safe, psychologically safe environment. And again, that comes back to that self-awareness, situational awareness, understanding relationships, because they may not show up authentically to begin with, and that's based on the relationship you're having. But being consistent with that time can grow your relationship as a leader and a team member, and maybe hopefully friendship down the road. But it absolutely provides them a space to grow, to really and to build that relationship.
Let's redefine the word friendship and think about respect. You might not be the best buddy that you're going to go out and have coffee together and talk about your lives, but you have respect for each other and you enjoy being with each other, which is part. I think about, my mother's used to say that manners are the grease that keep the wheels of society going. Another thing that I'm thinking about as you're saying this is talking about, especially in our diverse environment. Hopefully you're in an organization that's trying to be diverse, that's making an effort to get more diverse employees. That's where it could be safe for someone to say, yeah, this is a picture of my family, and look, that's my mom and all my aunts wearing their saris, and my uncles wearing turbans. And here we are, where before they didn't feel safe to talk about it.
Absolutely. And I want to just challenge any leader with the diversity statement as well, is that diversity isn't always obvious. Diversity isn't always cultural or the color of your skin or your accessibility. Diversity could be introverts, neurodivergent people, night owls. They could be completely different ways of working or how they communicate and how they build relationships. But to your point, it absolutely allows them to be themselves in that half an hour or whatever allocation of time you work with them, that will build that further relationship. And that's why I actually shouldn't say friends. I say colleagues more than I like to say friends, because friends, colleagues, you can grow in that familiarity, but it doesn't mean you're going to a movie on Friday night together either. It's that mutual respect of, I'm here for you, you're here for me, let's do a thing. But it's, like I said, a foundation of respect.
Yeah, there's the old phrase, a collegial relationship is that you are working with your colleagues. You have a good collegial relationship. Russell, let me ask you, as we were doing our preparation for this call, and you then mentioned how this has to be part of a leader's personal brand. And I thought, wait a minute, I often think of personal branding and leadership as two separate things. They're often classified as two, so you're putting them together.
Absolutely.
Okay, tell us about that.
Brand is, and I love this, it's an old statement of brand, is what do people say about you when you're not in the room? What is your reputation within the organization? And that goes hand in hand with you as a leader. What is your reputation as a leader? What is your brand as a leader? Because again, we were mentioning earlier about that busy person that's never has time for their staff, but they call themselves a leader. I'm like, I bet you most of your team doesn't. I bet you people in the organization don't. But that's your brand. Your brand within the organization is what people say about you. So you can say whatever you want, but if people have a different perception of you, that's their perception, and that's more truth than your own self thoughts.
Let's talk about the difference between a title and a brand.
Title, sure, I love that. You can have the loftiest title in the world, doesn't mean anything if the reputation you have within the organization. I don't care how many executive you have at the end of your title or letters after your name. It means nothing in regards to you as a leader. It's a responsibility, but responsibility and leadership are not the same thing. Responsibility is you have something you have to deliver for stakeholders, for customers. That's, or within the organization to get to that point. That's where your title begins and ends. Leadership is what we're talking about, that growth, respect, building other leaders, how you contribute to the health of the organization. Because health, just because you make money doesn't mean your employee retention is sticking around, or people aren't, people turning over like crazy, or your succession plans are horrible. Like, there's so much to the value of individuals that is not tied to anything around your titles. Titles, to me, have nothing to do with the health of the organization.
And actually, that's that sends me off on another line. There is that also, as a leader, everybody reports up to somebody, no matter what your title is or where you are in the hierarchy. So part of it is you have a responsibility to deliver results, and also to recognize, this is the friendship thing here, is that the people who have higher positions probably have 10 times as many responsibilities. Sure. So part of being a good leader, if you are a leader of a team that is then helping somebody who's a little more senior, is to deliver the information that the person who's looking at a larger picture can use.
I can't tell you how many times I've heard, and I'm going to put leaders in air quotes here, where if an employee or team member come to them and go, "What's your job?" to the leader, and the leader's response, I hate to say this, but I've heard this, is them saying, "To make my boss happy." That's my job, is to make my boss happy. If I was that employee or team member, my heart would break and I'd be looking for a new job within the next 5 seconds, because that should never be a leader's job. Is it to create an environment? Is it to create a widget? Is it to, there are deliverables, but your boss will be happy if you're creating great leaders, if you're contributing to the health of the organization. If you manage up, you're not leading. I think there was a great book by Kevin Oakes about reinventing culture. And he talks about how if you're shining your light up only, you're leaving your team in darkness. Like you're not leading at all. You are just helping that person individually in the top of the hierarchy. So
I love that
scares me.
say that one again. I think that's going to be one of our quotable quotes here.
Oh, sure. It's not even from my mouth. Yeah, absolutely. It's a Kevin Oakes quote where he talks about in his book, Reinventing Culture, where he basically says, if you're shining your light up, meaning if you're managing up only, you're leaving your team in the dark, that you are absolutely not helping, supporting. It's all about the people above you. That's, again, not leadership. Might be management, but it's not leadership.
So out of all these things, because I think I could talk to you about this for hours here, but we are going to spare our listeners. Is there one skill that a leader should manage or should look at or should really basically pay attention to first? People who are listening saying, I need to pay more attention here. What's one thing that people could do?
I think it's understanding your organization, and I want to break it down into sort of the missing middle is where I would like them to focus their time. So in every organization, there is the rock stars and there are those that are the challenges. So
the people who are the people who are challenging. Yeah. Okay.
Demand your time, demand your, there's something, I mean, every organization has challenges. Everybody does. But the thing is that there's those 20%, say 10 or 20% at the top. Those are the people you go to. Those are the rock stars. Those are the great people that you know are going to get the job done. And they're self-directed and this sort of thing. And then there's those bottom 10 or 20% that need your time to work yourself through difficult conversations and so forth. The problem is we are ignoring the middle of that. We spend so much of our time at the top and at the bottom that there's this missing middle of employees that aren't getting the direction, support, connection, relationships, because they might be work in a different way, or they might have other responsibilities outside of work, like family, that doesn't allow them to be knocking at the boss's door every 5 minutes with, hey, I'm awesome, or hey, this place sucks. Like they are absolutely needing leadership, but because they are not obvious, they are ignored, not nurtured, and they're your succession plan. They're the workforce that wants to matter. And if you're spending all your time at the top and the bottom, you are not leading the majority of your team.
Ooh, I really like this concept. That's a really good idea to pay attention to the people in the middle. And indeed, often the people who are just doing the job and do that. And for the people who are the ones who just come in and do your job and do whatever you can do, talking about that, that's a skill. That's a skill that is easy to ignore because you're not the trouble person or the rock star. And so I have a whole program, especially for women, about the value of things not going wrong. And the great Bonita Bonducci says it very well, that we have a culture that is geared to celebrate the firefighters, the people who are putting out the fires, and hooray, but nobody talks about the ones who make sure that the sprinklers are charged and the smoke alarms are charged and make sure that there's not going to be a fire. So you get all sorts of attention for putting out a fire, but meanwhile the house is burned down and the family doesn't have any place to live. No one's talking about the neighbor who makes sure the fire doesn't start.
Great metaphor. I love that. Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's a good one. Russel Lolacher, this has been so much fun. I love this conversation. I love the way we're talking about it, and delighted to have you as a guest. So this has been Speakers Who Get Results. I'm Elizabeth Bachman, your host. If you enjoyed this, please Tell your friends, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, even if you're not listening on Apple, because that's the one that counts. Spread the word, subscribe to us, spread the word so I can get more great people like Russel Lolacher into really interesting conversations. This is Elizabeth Bachman. I'll see you on the next one.
We have just concluded another great episode of Speakers Who Get Results with your host, Elizabeth Bachman. If you got value from today's episode, please feel free to share us with your friends and colleagues. You may also visit elizabethbachman.com for additional resources. Be sure to tune in every week for new episodes, and thanks for tuning in.